give you peace and heal you. Lift up your heart in praise of Christ who has redeemed you. Praises and failing mercy, praises and changing love. Lift up your heart, for by His might He will guard your path and guide you. Lift up your heart unceasing, praising the Savior's name. Lift up your heart, for He has ransomed you. Lift up your heart, for He will succor you. Lift up your heart, for He has offered you a crown of everlasting life. A crown of everlasting life.
Our scripture reading is found in Luke chapter 10, verse 27. In Luke 10, verse 27. It says, "And he answered, saying, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself." This morning, as we come to worship the Lord together, we have come very fast to the end, towards the end of the year, and the second last week, towards the end of the quarter in our series, Growing Young. As we have gone through all the different chapters of the book, we come to the last chapter together, and it tells us to be the best neighbors. And I've entitled my sermon, Love Your Neighbor. Because indeed, if we look into the essence of the gospel in itself, without love, the rest are just rules, right? Without love, Jesus will not have died for us. Without love, God will not have shed His life and created us as well. And of course, without love, we will not be reconciled and coming back to be with Him together in heaven. You know, I was reading this story this week, and it's a story that I believe some of you might have read, and I think it's been appearing quite a fair bit in some of the news. Of this man, I'm not sure how many of you know him. He's a rich billionaire. In the past, you know, as he was a wealthy billionaire, people couldn't find out where his money had disappeared. But over the years, people started to track, and later he even set up his own foundation. Most billionaires would save their money so that they could have much as they could, and only after they die, they would set up their foundation in their name, and it would slowly give away the money over years and years. And ultimately, sometimes this would happen in a sense where it might bog down a little bit by bureaucracy, and sometimes they might end up throwing pennies at the $10 problem. But this billionaire, his name, if you don't know him, his name is Chuck Finney, and he set up a foundation that he aimed by, I believe it was September, or just recently, he wanted to donate his wealth away before he passed away. And so they set up this foundation many years ago and they have successfully donated away 6 billion of his wealth away to many different causes, to even help the system in Northern Ireland, the education system, in Vietnam, in different causes, of course, with many education institutions around the world, as well as many charitable causes, including remodeling one of the islands in New York to be a better place. And so there are many different things that he gave towards different charitable causes that was touching his heart. And he could, as the founder, he didn't have to be limited, by people who decided after his death, oh, maybe this is not quite what the founder wants, but rather he could decide as he wanted where the money should go. And so because of his benevolence and his decision to give away his wealth, he inspired others, famous people that we would know, like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, where in 2011 they started a joint pledge, and of course getting others along to donate at least half their wealth or more of it before they would pass away. And so in this itself, it encouraged others to look beyond themselves. They feel the joy of giving and seeing causes come to fruition when they were alive. Because that, and he as a person, if you check into him, he lives frugally. He doesn't fly in or live in a very expensive place. They describe his accommodation as like similar to a freshman's dorm. And I thought it was very impressive to note that whatever he had, he felt he just lived simply within his means, and more of it he gave and gave to make the world a better place. He gave because he felt that was his duty to give. He gave because he felt he loved others, he cared for others, and he felt the joy of giving. And that in itself, in turn, inspired others to give as well. Warren Buffett said that he had started giving, but for himself, he will probably end up finishing giving away his wealth 12 years after his death. But regardless, his story has inspired others to do the same. It has helped others to look beyond themselves and all that they had, and look to see the different things that people are going through around the world, the different causes that I need, education, poverty, and so on and so forth, wherever causes that touch their hearts. And I thought this morning it was a rather suitable thought, because when we look at our neighbor, we ask ourselves, who is our neighbor? And for in this case of this man, the person that he felt the cause was that moved him was indeed his neighbor, the person that he would step forward to give, step forward to help, and help in whatever means that he could. And of course, if we come towards the Bible too, I'd just like to mention one of the statements that kind of impressed upon me that was mentioned by Warren Buffett of this man. He said, when you've got the right model or idol or whatever, the person to look up to, 90% of your work is in the right direction. And he said, and Chuck Finney, for him, is a good person to model after. And as I thought about it, of how this man impressed upon others, giving, looking beyond yourselves, making charitable causes, loving others, of course, it brings me to the Bible, in the parable of the Good Samaritan in itself. Here you can see I leave the free Bible images quoted. We want to give credit where credit is due. And so when we look into it, we see that there is definitely a model as well in our Bible that we look to. And that is, of course, none other than Jesus himself. And of course, in Jesus' parable in itself, the parable of the Good Samaritan, of the neighbor, of the people, of the groups of people, of certain different various groups that we perhaps, maybe at times, may have neglected, perhaps at times may have paid less attention to. But let's take a look at it together this morning. In Luke 10, verse 27, this parable was important enough that is found in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But today we will be looking at it from the point of Luke chapter 10, where the idea of love your neighbor is. A scholar came to Jesus, and in those days, rabbis were often tested with questions to be able to see, how they answered, and people would marvel at their knowledge. And so, in the Old Testament itself, according to the counting, there are said to be about 613 such different commandments. And 200 over which are more of the positive side, do this, do that, and 200 over of these are the do this, do that, and 300 over of these are those do not, the shall not, and all these things. And so, asking such a question of which is the greatest commandment was something actually not too rare in those days of Jesus. In one of the famous rabbis, Rabbi Hillel, was also asked such a question, which is the greatest commandment? And the answer that he gave, I paraphrase, is the idea that you shall do to others what you would do for yourself. In other words, do to others what you will do to yourself. And the others are commentary. So that was indeed somewhat of a wise saying. But of course, Jesus goes a step further, and we will see that today. And Jesus first answered him, quoting Deuteronomy 6 verse 5, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your strength, all your soul. And then he combined that with in Leviticus as well, to love your neighbor as yourself, in Leviticus 19:18. These two commandments are in two different parts of the Old Testament. They were not put together, but Jesus put them together, showing that loving God in of itself is not complete. Love your neighbor is the part of the package, and it comes together as one commandment, that indeed that is the greatest commandment of all. And so the person who asked it, he thought to himself, he had been observing all these righteous requirements of the law. He didn't want to acknowledge that he perhaps himself had not been too loving towards others. He looked at the laws and he's like, yeah, I think I'm doing just fine. And so then he decided to divert the question and ask Jesus, so who is my neighbor? And as he, of course, asked that question, Jesus told this story of the parable of the Good Samaritan. So here we have the illustration of the person asking. So, of course, a man was traveling between Jerusalem and Jericho, and as he was traveling along the way, we see that there were some robbers who were awaiting for such lonely travelers. And as he went along the way, they presently came upon him, beat him up, and took all his belongings, stripped him of his possessions, and left him there to die. And as they left him there to die, presently, of course, we have people coming along, since it's a common road between Jerusalem and Jericho. First, we have the priest. He comes by, take a look at the man, and decided to walk on the other side, thinking to himself, well, if I were to trouble myself, I would become ritually unclean. I don't know whether he's dead or alive, right? If he's dead, I will have a period, some days where I need to, and maybe, someone will help him, perhaps he thought to himself. And so he went along his way. And presently, another man came along the way too, another Levite. He came, and he looked at the man, perhaps thought to himself a similar thing, and also went on his way, thinking that he could not bother himself with this man, because you never know, right? Perhaps he's already dead, no point to check. And so the man continued to lay there, dying. And as he lay there, of course, we know the story. Presently, a good Samaritan came along. A Samaritan, he's not good until it's the name coined by us, of course. He came along, he saw the man, he rushed over to him. He took care of him, he had compassion on him. He poured wine upon his wounds, gave him, of course, water, dressed his wounds. And then he took him upon his donkey as well, and brought him to the nearest inn, and told the innkeeper, whatever that is charged, that needs for this man's stays, whatever you need to use to take care of him, charge it to me. I will take care of everything. And of course, the man was taken care of by the innkeeper, whatever that was needed, and a place to stay, and he paid, of course, whatever that was needed. And so after the story, of course, Jesus then asked the man, So who is your neighbor? Who is my neighbor? Of course, the man answered the man who showed compassion on him, the man who loved him. Sometimes as we look in this story, as I look in this story, I started to reflect upon myself and reflect upon, sometimes, do I truly love my neighbor? Are there perhaps certain people groups that I may choose or maybe not choose, have not interacted with, kept a distance away from? Perhaps it could be on the different things, like in this case of the story, different races, different cultures. Are there some of these things that perhaps may have kept a barrier between us and them? You know, as I was reading also the book Growing Young, some of these questions I think were reflective. Maybe, of course, in Singapore's context, we sometimes I may not be willing to admit some of these things, but this is something for us to reflect and for food for thought. You know, just as the man, as a Jew, and the Samaritan, they were supposed to be enemies. They would rather the person die and leave him to die. Perhaps as a common enemy, they may have just put in the last nail and make sure he died, rather than being safe. But he did the very opposite, right, of what it was in his culture, what was in his upbringing to do. He went and had compassion on him. He went and saved him. He went and loved him. You know, some of the questions that I reflected upon, as also was asked, how many friends do we have of different cultures, different race? How many of them do we meet up for a meal, do we keep in contact with? Or is it something that is done out of intention, or perhaps just done just because it's our norm? And I thought these are valid things to consider, considering that, we all live in a multi-ethnic society. But sometimes, some of these things, there may be neighbors that we may have inadvertently kept at a length, whether by choice or by custom as well. And of course, we see Jesus here talking with the person who asked the question. And so if we look in some of these things, it's a little long, but don't mind, we ask our question to ourselves first, who is my neighbor? And as we mentioned, for Jesus himself, his neighbor is the one that is in need. His neighbor extends beyond different boundaries. We have talked about the different cultural, racial boundaries. How about different neighbors? There could be also neighbors that extend across social, economic status, right? Sometimes in different parts, normally in the world, we tend to not really have the opportunity to mix across the board. In church, however, we do have such opportunities. But do we take the opportunities, or do we stay in our comfort zone? I think there's some of these questions that kind of thought about it, and it does make us wonder, right? Who do we really consider our neighbors? Do we extend it to all, or do we just leave it to a select few? As we continue to look in the idea of the neighbor, we see that rather than seeing what looks good to others, the idea of doing good in itself is to be there. Sometimes, in church, we have different projects, different things, of course, to do what is good as well. But ultimately, all these things always stem, and it starts from person, right? All of us as different individuals make up the church, right? And when we take that first step, things can go the next step and along the way. I am reminded of a story of a cleanup in a beach at East Coast. And this person saw the different rubbish there at East Coast Beach. And so, week by week, she started to pick up the different rubbish there, and she started to post her efforts and invited people to join along. And of course, naturally, there are people who have like-minded interests. They saw it, and they started together, safely, in groups of 5, and they did different parts of the beach. And I think, of course, over time, they gathered more and more people who saw these efforts, saw the wonderful thing that was being done, and thousands of people joined and even one of the ministers for, I think, environment also joined one of these times. You know, whatever bit of good that God has called us to do, this is the good that God has called us. Sometimes we may not be able to do it from different areas. It may start with us, just as our discipleship team always tells us. It may start with us, but when we take the first step, knowing that this is what God has called us to do, the next step, we can always gather more people to join us along this journey, along the way. We look into the idea of, being hospitable to others, compassionate to others. It's important sometimes, I think, in the idea of debate, in the idea of disagreement. Sometimes we learn in church, we often have this idea of being prescriptive, We tell others, this is wrong, we may tell others, love your neighbor, but hate the sin, right? Or they say, love the sinner, hate the sin. And sometimes this mantra might have been often over-repeated. But, people can see us for who we are. They may feel that, wow, this is just a statement in itself. But until we take that step to engage others, until we take that step to discuss, to hear different views, and we may not be overly prescriptive, there is the opportunity, right, for that dialogue, that opportunity for discussion. And that in itself is an important thing, right? Because I think sometimes, we all already have all these different sets of rules. But dialogue in today's world, especially if we look in the young people, is more important than ever. People want to be heard. People want to be heard along the way. I remember a story of that was told by Pastor Justin Young that came here last year in the Discipleship Congress. And he said that one of the things that he did was that when he visited different people, sometimes when he was just there with the youth, he just sat there, the youth talked for 3 hours, and after that, he said, okay, thank you very much, prayed for them, and left. And that in itself, the youth said, wow, this is my best pastor, this is the best person, just go to him, you just listen to you just feel better. And sometimes as a neighbor in itself, I look at the element there where listening becomes one of the different elements of being a good neighbor. Discussion becomes one of the elements of being a good neighbor. And of course, there is also the idea of compassion, because Jesus talks about love your neighbor, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. There's this idea, of course, of both emotional, both also social, the idea of also spiritual, and of course, logical as well. And so all these different areas kinds of shows us that compassion in itself, the idea of reaching out to others, both in all different ways in itself, comes together to makes us best neighbors. There is, of course, in that sense, the opportunity to keep our eyes open for others. And I think this point itself is sometimes maybe, understated. And I'm glad that Pastor Bayu brought it up, although I also had planned to bring it up during this sermon. Sometimes when we look at being the best neighbors, we don't have to go very far. We need not to have to go out into far in the community. Love starts at home. Love starts right here at the church. And if we sometimes look back at our feedback at our live streaming, we always look at all the different failures, all the different flaws that it has. But have we also looked at who is behind all these things? Have we looked at what will this person feel when we give such a feedback? How can we give it such feedback in a loving manner? I'd like to bring our attention, just as Pastor has done, that we have different young people being involved. Like this morning, we saw one of our young people, Chuen, give the prayer. And I think that's the first for all the different youths. We have seen Carl helping with the camera work for all these months. And this morning, Dwayne as well as helping out in the switching. Some of these things sometimes may not be perfect, may not be up to your expectations. But how can we give affirmation? How can we be the best neighbors? How can we show love in a way that is not just all about being perfect, but growing in what we are doing, showing love in what we are doing, showing care? Now, of course, like Pastor, I like to encourage us, send some affirmation their way, send some care their way. whether in the various ways that God has impressed you to. Because indeed, being the best neighbors doesn't just start from far away. It starts at home, it starts at our church. So the idea there of patient neighbors respect the journey and destination. This is the journey in itself, right? We sometimes often hear, we may like to look at the destination, how everything is perfectly done, everything is great, just as a wonderful world-class service. But there is this journey as well, and this journey needs to be respected as well. This journey needs to be embraced. The people behind it also feel. The people behind it are our neighbors. And these are the people that God has called us to love. To love. Courageous neighbors embrace ethnic diversity. We have talked about that, as well as the social economic diversity. And so wise neighbors here help young people discover their calling. You know, when I sat down with the young people, I remember at the end of the last year, when we had our youth camp, and asked them, what would you like to see in our youth ministry? They mentioned things like helping out people in old folks' home, helping out animals in the animal shelter, going overseas to do mission trips, and so on and so forth. They were also willing to help out in various areas. And sometimes, you know, when we see, they are also, of course, they are also interested, of course, to learn from the adults on different careers they are doing, different things they can learn from, and it helps them to discover more of their calling in life beyond just doing another job. And I really liked when one of the youth said that they wanted to leave an impact before they no longer was a youth anymore. You know, our youth have different callings that they need to be discovered. There are different passions that they also have. But sometimes, you know, there may be many different areas to serve. We may decide arbitrarily, like, you know, if you love to serve, you must serve in this way or that way, and other ways are closed off. But when you have seen, just as in my story, when that person's interest is to pick up rubbish in the East Coast Park, they gather and more people join. And so what we are there is not to dictate or to prescribe what is that they can serve in, but perhaps help them to discover what they love, help them to discover what job that helps them in their calling, help them to discover as they serve where they can find joy in their service, and I believe they will go much further. And so today, as we look at this idea of who is my neighbor, it reminds me once again of Jesus and, of course, the Good Samaritan. You know, there are different common pitfalls sometimes that we want to avoid, and I'd just like to mention a few. Yeah. One of it, as I mentioned, is aiming for perfection. When being the best neighbors, we always like, of course, it's very nice to have things perfectly. But oftentimes, you know, when we choose to put the task more important than the person, the perfection achieved may come at a cost of someone's feelings, someone who has to suffer certain things. And so I'm not saying that we just don't care, do whatever we can. But as I mentioned, it's about respecting both the journey and the destination. There is a way that we can affirm, there is a way we can encourage, a way we can love and guide. And I think some, of course, have done well. You know, we have different people stepping in to help along this journey. But it is also a call to all of us, you know, to look beyond ourselves, look beyond the program, to look at the people behind the program, and not to see them as not performing their job, not living up to expectations, but see them as our neighbor, maybe dying along spiritually, physically, emotionally, but still yet serving the church. And they are in need of you to help, to dress their wounds. They are in need for you to dare to give them water, in need for you to give them a word to encourage them along the way. Copying and competing. I think it's often that we feel that when we copy certain churches, we compete, and then there is the idea that as long as we follow the model that has been given, that is the best. But what I've come to learn is that, you know, about 10 years ago when we all believed that, you know, this is the best way, and I was following Gateway and coming with all these cell group methods, we realize that methods are good in certain cultures, certain contexts, and yes, some of these principles can be carried over, but when we try to duplicate them exactly as a successful church has done, often it doesn't work because we fail to consider our own context. And so what I'm trying to tell us is, let's not compare, like look at another church and say, oh, this church does better than us, or this church, they can do this. Yes, we can learn lessons from them, but the answer is not in copying them and duplicating it and finding us. The answer comes in finding in ourselves, within our culture, within our manpower, within ourselves, where is how well we can do and what we can do moving forward. Of course, they also have another pitfall, condemning and critiquing, which I mentioned a bit just now. There is of course, common fallacy that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. I think that could never be further than the truth. Right? It says in Proverbs, if I remember correctly, a word fitly or aptly or spoken at the right time is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The right word at the right time can help a person to go so much further. Looking just at my own experience, I remember when I was just a few months ago in a point where I had taken on more than I could carry, and I was reaching a point of slight burnout. Someone who spoke to me, and I still remember this very clearly, told me that we are a team. He told me that you don't have to blame yourself. We carry the burdens together. I will take responsibility for you and with you. And I believe that was something that kept me going, helped me to rediscover of how I could do things better and not lose hope amidst all the things that were drowning me out. And that is exactly what our neighbors need, or what being a best neighbor is about. It's about telling others that indeed we are there for them. We are a team, and not just saying it, but literally doing it as well. And that in itself will go so much further than the opposite, of course, in aiming for perfection, critiquing, and all these things. That in itself will spur people to give of their best as we help them to discover what in itself that God has called them to do. That will bring us so much further, and that will bring us the best neighbors. And so there isn't that one right silver bullet. Sometimes it's tempting to believe that we have a silver bullet, whether it's in the form of a program. Even our D group program is no silver bullet, even though we have promoted it as well. It is just one of the ways that we can reach our end goal, which is to be disciples for Jesus. And so we have to look beyond having this one program, this one equipment, this one thing that can make our church kind of what it's meant to be. But we look to people. And of course, people come in all shapes and sizes, in different packages, different upbringings, and so on and so forth. But what we can do, just as what the Good Samaritan has done, is to realize that all that man needs is some help, is some compassion. And when we have healed him, he can get back on his feet once again. And I think, as Pastor Bayer has mentioned last week, all of us are broken, myself included. You may not see the different brokenness I have, or maybe you can see it very clearly, but what I'm trying to say is that it's there that we acknowledge that while we are broken, we can still help others where we are. When we have received love from God, we are to extend this love to all around, starting with our neighbors, which are our fellow members, starting with our neighbors, which are our youths, because this quarter is on growing young. Being the best neighbors means, as Jesus has said, loving God with all our heart, all our soul, all our strength, and all our mind. And Jesus added all our mind in itself, in addition to Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, because he wanted this totality of our love to him. And as we have receive God's love along the way, may we also extend His love to others. Because our neighbor, our fellow members, our youths, they are in need for you to bandage their wounds. They are in need there for you to guide. They are in need there to listen, for you to listen to their stories, for you to be open for discussion and not just prescription. And as I pray, as we love our neighbors, as we love God and love our neighbors in one package, I pray that indeed our church will continue to move forward, having God's love in our hearts, moving away from the different perfection, the criticism and critique, but move forward to this affirming culture, this culture that Pastor Bayu has announced this morning that we are trying to build. As we love, as we affirm, as we give of ourselves, I pray that our church will be truly the church that Jesus has called us to be, to love our neighbor as ourselves. So at this time, we ask that the song leaders come as we sing this love that makes us happy, because only God's love can make us truly happy, and only by sharing His love with the youth and with others that they can truly be happy as well. May God bless us as we hear His word. Benediction. May the love of the Father, the grace of our Son Jesus Christ, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.